For those of you who don't know, and you should, Astro runs Google X and is chief astronaut there. And Google X's job is really moonshot projects that will be truly differentiating technologies and projects to make the world a better place and to make money at the same time. And so Astro, the natural place for us to start is what are the X projects around climate and energy that are exciting you the most? And then we'll talk a little about what you've learned from them.
Well, I think first maybe very briefly to explain what a moonshot is so that you know where we're coming from. In order for something to be exciting for us at X, something for us to focus on, it has to have three basic parts. It has to have, number one, a huge problem in the world that we can name and we want to fix. Number two, there has to be some kind of science fiction sounding product or service that, however unlikely it is that we could make it, we can say if we could make that, it would solve that huge problem in the world. And then the third thing that we need to be able to identify is some technology grounding that satisfies us, not that we can definitely make that science fiction sounding product or service, but at least that we have a shot at it, that we can get started and start iterating, that we can take at least the first step or two down the path. So that is not a recipe that drives us exclusively to spend time in climate change, but obviously since climate change is one of the biggest problems in the world, climate change comes up all the time as a proposed huge problem in the world to solve. So when someone says, let's solve climate change, the answer that they get not only from me, but from everyone at X is, that's awesome, pat, 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 but that's not a moonshot. You have to propose all three of these things. Now, we have taken some shots on goal, as it were, in what you might think of as the core of climate change, that is generating energy. I think of a sort of second shell around that as transmitting energy or storing energy, which is going to be tremendously important in fighting climate change. But there's actually a third shell, which is even bigger, which is how we use energy. So let me start at that outer ring, and then I'm going to come inwards. There are things that we're not doing primarily because of the benefits to fighting climate change, but they have a tremendous opportunity to do just that. For example, self-driving cars, which came out of X, it's now its own business within the Alphabet world. We didn't say on day one, let's do this to fix climate change. But in fact, the benefits of having computers drive cars instead of humans driving cars is very substantial in terms of the carbon footprint per mile that humans are driven. And so we feel good about that, and that's why I think of that in that outer ring. Another example that's in that outer ring, the self-flying vehicles that we have for package delivery. We did not say on day one, we're going to do this because it's going to fix climate change. But if you look at the carbon footprint of taking an Advil to your house, a burrito to your house, a pair of tennis shoes to your house from Amazon, the carbon footprint of getting it there is enormous. And one of the benefits of flying it to you instead is that the carbon footprint of moving it to you is much, much smaller. So now let's come in more towards the core. We've tried some things that haven't worked. We've tried some things that are maybe still going to work. I'll give you a few examples.
Can you talk about the things that haven't worked a little bit? Just what, I think people would be interested, just some of the things that you were probing or exploring, if you could.
Sure. So one of the ones that we're most proud of that didn't work was we got excited about the idea of turning seawater into methanol. The thinking behind that is there are about 4 billion internal combustion engines in the world right now, and they've already been paid for. It's a sunk cost, so they're not going away for the next decade no matter what. So if we want to take on climate change, one of the most basic things we need to do is put something carbon negative into those fuel tanks, because the way they're built, they're going to burn hydrocarbons, and the hydrocarbons going to put CO2 back into the atmosphere. Okay, how could you make a fuel that's carbon negative when you put it in the gas tank so that the whole circle is carbon neutral? Well, if you use clean energy, something like wind or solar, as your energy source, and you suck CO2 out of the sea, then the partial pressure between the oceans and the atmosphere is different, and so the ocean will suck more CO2 out of the atmosphere into the ocean to keep it in balance. You take that CO2 you have, you take a little bit more of the ocean water, you split it into oxygen and hydrogen, you jam the hydrogen and the CO2 together, and you can make methanol, and then you stick that in the gas tank. Huh. So, sounds like science fiction. We actually, over about a 2-year period, built a product, and we're making little vials of methanol. And we were unbelievably excited about this. Now, we weren't stupid. We understood that ultimately the techno-economics of this was going to decide whether it lived or died. But we thought we had line of sight on day one to getting into the range of sort of maybe $5 or $6 gallon of gas equivalent. At the time when we started, gas was at $5 or $6 a gallon of gas equivalent. So we thought, okay, fine. You know, it's not more, it's not better, but that's fine because this is a save the world kind of moment. Everyone's going to buy the right thing if it's the same price, no problem. So 2 things happened on the way to the forum, right? The first is that the cost of gas dropped down to $3, and so even if everything else had stayed the same, it's arguable that we wouldn't have been able to get there. But there were a whole bunch of researchers who, in our early discussions, assured us that they had magical techniques for, turns out the hardest part of doing all of this is actually splitting the oxygen and the hydrogen apart in water so that you can isolate the hydrogen so you can jam it with the CO2. And we had a number of researchers who said, oh, don't worry, I've got a special way of splitting the oxygen and the hydrogen apart. But the more we dug into it, the more the special way looked like it had a bunch of techno-economic Achilles heels. And by the time we were 2 years in and had this box working, it was absolutely working, and we had line of sight to get this down, if we were to make a sizable factory for this, to about $15 a gallon of gas equivalent. That's not going to save the world. No one's going to buy that. I mean, there are niche markets where you can sell that. So we killed the project. We published in Fast Company the sort of business perspective on why we stopped doing this, to let people know in case someone could figure out what we hadn't. And we just last week published the scientific details of this in the International Journal of Greenhouse Gas Control. And so that's another way where we said,
put it out there, open source
we want
it.
the world to solve this problem. We couldn't figure out how to do it. I mean, maybe at some point in the future we'll figure out how, but even if we don't, maybe somebody else will.
Fascinating. So tell us the ones that are exciting you now, where you see both the economics and line of sight. You know.
Sure, I'll give you an example of something where we've taken the first half of the way, and I think it's going to take partners to take it the second half of the way, and one where we're still working on it internally. So the one that's in that middle zone is there's a Nobel laureate named Bob Laughlin who proposed a different way of storing energy, grid scale storage of energy. So basically the way a refrigerator works, you would think in order to make 100 watts of cold, you have to spend 100 watts of energy. But it actually kind of doesn't work like that. Because you have to throw off more than 100 watts of energy because of the second law of thermodynamics to get 100 watts of cold in there. You can actually keep the cold and the hot, which sort of looks like you're getting something for nothing if you want to. So you run what you could think of as a refrigerator, and you get a whole bunch of hot and a bunch of cold, and you store the cold here and the hot here, and then later when you want to get energy back, you put them near each other, and you run an energy cycle where the hot and cold can drive a Carnot engine, basically a turbine, and generate electricity. And so if you're thinking about doing this, there's some basic questions. And he proposed a model for how to do this that was particularly high efficiency, so that the round trip efficiency from electrons in to electrons out would be on the order of sort of 65%. Pumped hydro, which is about the best grid scale storage that you can get, is sort of in the high 70s. So this isn't quite as good as that, but to get pumped hydro in a box, because you can't have a mountain and a valley to move water up and down just because you want to anywhere, that would really change the world of renewables. So he'd proposed this, but there's a big difference between proposing it and having all of the details worked out. He came to us, we got excited about it, we started working on it, we've worked out all of the technical details, and we now really believe there's a there there, and we can be very specific about that. But in order to take it the next step, you would need to build a sizable factory-like thing. It's a large facility. Even a small pilot of this would be like the size of this room, basically. And you need to have a kind of Six Sigma mentality as you build it, because the banks are not going to give you the money to put this down until they see that this has 20-year lifespans. X is not in the business of making something half the size of this room, and it's not in the business of thinking in terms of Six Sigma and 20-year lifespans. So the right next step for us is to take what we've learned and some of these people and to launch it out into the world with some partners, with investors, with people who know manufacturing, with some utility partners to get going at that next stage.
Very cool.
So I would call that a success, but not the kind of success that we're going to take all the way ourselves. And sometimes that's the right thing to do.
Any other? And I want to hear any others.
Yeah, let me give you one or two others. Actually, before I go to one that we're still doing, I'll give you another example. Geo Heat Pumps. Basically, if you're somewhere where it's sometimes very hot and sometimes very cold, then by far the best way to heat and cool your house, which is a huge use of energy around the developed world, by far the best way to do it is just have some water. You could do air, but water's much more efficient. And you put the water underground and bring it back up again. And if it's just, think of it as a loop, then all you're paying is the friction in the pipe, because there's water going down, it's kind of cantilevered against the water going up. So it takes almost no energy to move the water around. But the water, when it's down below ground, ends up at the temperature that's 30 feet below the ground, which is always in the sort of 50, 60 degree temperature range. So if you could essentially for free get your house to the temperature it is 30 feet underground, when it's super cold, you can get close to a comfortable temperature almost for free. And when it's super hot outside, you can get close to the underground temperature almost for free.
We have that in our house.
So why don't people do this? Well, the reason is because it takes 3 or 4 days, and they destroy your yard digging it up, as they probably did with yours. So what if it could happen in 3 hours instead of 3 days, and your yard wasn't destroyed? Might that be the switch that would cause huge numbers of people to start doing this? So we spent 2 years and built the robotics necessary to do that. We had a big party, we felt really good, and then we realized, oh wait, now the next step is this ground game where we have to go dig up people's yards and market people so that they feel good about us digging up their yards, and the financing that comes right after the digging up of people's yards. This is a real business, but this is not one that X should be in. So we took that effort and we stuck it outside of X as its own standalone venture-backed business, which is called Dandelion. And they're now doing this.
You keep a piece of it, basically.
Yeah, we keep a piece of it, and it goes on, and the founders are the team that came from X, and other investors come in, and they're off to the races and already doing it in the Northeast. So that's another example that sort of we took part of the way. An example of something that we've worked on for quite a few years, and we still believe in, is airborne wind turbines. So we've always had this hypothesis that there's something about the hundreds of tons of steel and concrete necessary to get this turbine to sit 300, 400 feet up in the air. There's just something wrong with that. It's got to be possible to get the energy generation way up there, but not have all of that weight. Because onshore you can kind of justify it, but you cannot justify it offshore. But most of the real wind resource, because it's so steady, because there's no like NIMBY issues where people are irritated if it's offshore by a couple miles even. And most people live right in coastal areas. There's billions and billions of people who live within 25 miles of the sea, an ocean, and yet most of those places, it's so deep, the bottom falls down so much that it's enormously expensive to have a big pylon go all the way down to the ground. And it's super expensive to make a floating platform so big that you can hold 500 or 600 tons on top of it, in case of a 50-foot wave. So what if you made something that looked like a small airplane, but it had no body in the middle? It was just the wing and a bunch of propellers, and it has this tether that it pulls out as it lifts up. So it looks like a UAV almost, but it's tethered, and it's pulling energy up the tether. And when it gets out to about 400 or 500 meters, it starts to do circles in the sky. And now when the wind blows through that circle, instead of those things, don't think of them as propellers anymore in the drive the airplane sense, think of them as little bitty wind turbines. and it's going in this circle, and it can generate energy at about 1/20th the weight of one of these things. So for islands and offshore, there's just a tremendous advantage there. We think it's going to open up a huge new set of renewable resources for the
And these have been prototyped? I mean,
yes, absolutely. So we have one. The wingspan is sort of roughly from here to the back of this room. And we're flying it right now. We're doing lots of circles in the sky and gathering lots of data. This is a long-term project, but we think it may well be worth it.
So I'm sure one of the questions people have here is, what's it like to work at X? Who works there? How do you work as collaborative teams to spark these ideas? Take us back to the beginning of like that idea. Somebody comes in and said, God, I was in the shower this morning and I saw a turbine up there, and these things. How does it all happen?
So I'm going to give you one sort of thread through it. Ask me if you want different ones.
Yeah.
But I'm going to start with a woman named Cathy Cooper. Cathy Cooper started in the marketing group within Loon. There was only 1 or 2 people there. Loon is our stratospheric balloon project. And while she was still there, I remember a meeting that I had with her where she said, what if we could harvest the power in an avalanche? Get energy from that. And I said, God, that's a gorgeous question. I love that. Massive brownie points. Okay, how fast can we kill that idea? Because that's the ethos at X. So she's beaming from the first moment of this conversation because she just got this huge positive feedback from me. Then we went to a whiteboard, and it wasn't even 20 minutes till we satisfied ourselves that that's not the right way to generate energy, that just doesn't pencil out.
Yeah.
And then I high-fived her because we had been able so quickly, so dispassionately and intellectually to discard that as an idea. And she left the room with 2 pieces of brownie points, even though nothing had happened. It looks like it netted to 0, but that's not how she left the room feeling. So she, in the background, went and did her master's in computer sciences that happened at Stanford. But she then joined our rapid evaluation team for a while. And she started Foghorn, that was our name for this seawater to methanol project. She had no background in chemistry, but she had an incredible hunger for organizing things. And we had a set of relationships with Xerox PARC, where they had a bunch of the sort of bits and pieces that we could work on, and she brought together a team to drive that. Then, 2 years later, when it was time to kill it, she's the one who stood up and said, let's kill this, it's just not going to work out for the reasons that I described. She got a promotion soon afterwards, which just generally does not happen right after people kill their projects. And she got it at least in part because she had done so great with that project and because she had killed it at the right time and for the right reasons. Then she started a new project, which turns out about 2 years later, we decided shouldn't stay at X and got spun out, and she is now the CEO of Dandelion.
Amazing.
So just apropos of these things that we were talking about, and I think many people at X feel like they go through those kind of cycles where if we're passionately dispassionate, if we care about getting to the right answer, we're going to use passion and optimism most of the time to kind of push our way through or sneakily get around the problems. But we pause on a regular basis and say, look, if there's an Achilles heel here, we want to know it right now. How are we going to find it, kill this project, and get on to something more important? And as long as the community makes those social norms feel good, it's easy, actually.
Very cool. Astro, are there things that you see around the issue of decarbonization really way out on the edge? You know what I mean? Even beyond the things you've discussed so far, but that intrigue you, where you think, wow, there might be something there?
I see several, but let me give you an example that I don't think is out on the edge, except that I don't think people are counting it in their sort of project drawdown way of thinking about what our choices are. So there was an announcement about a year ago that part of Alphabet, called DeepMind, had done some work using their sort of AI system, which had figured out a way to allow the Google data systems, which are enormous users of energy, as you might imagine, and a lot of that energy goes into cooling the data centers, because when you put the energy into the computers, they get hot, and there's only so hot they can get before they stop working, so you spend a lot of extra energy cooling them down. And DeepMind found ways of redoing how that cooling worked that's now saving Google and the planet 40% of the energy they were using before.
Fascinating.
And I promise you, they were very interested in using as little energy as possible before, so there was not particularly low-hanging fruit here. It's just that a human couldn't figure out a better way to save that next 40%, but this AI system could. So that makes me wonder, how many things are there in the world that we could make 10% better, 40% better, and by better I mean use 40% less energy, or maybe time shifting the energy to places where it's cheaper because renewables are handing more energy to the grid. By doing those kind of things, we might be able to take a huge chunk out of the world's use of CO2 without actually having less energy at our disposal, and without even necessarily adding more renewables to the grid. I mean, I hope we do that also, but I think that people, when they get so spun up about their Terminator visions of AI, that they forget all the incredible opportunities that it presents. And solving climate change is probably near the top of the list of the things that it will turn out that AI is going to do for us.
It's that, what I call that ability to analyze, optimize, prophesize, customize.
Right.
I think now is and it's spreading everywhere. You know, I know this audience is bursting with questions. I'm going to be a little less selfish this morning. If anybody has a question for Astro, we got a few minutes left. Please raise your hand and go right ahead. And I can hear you without a mic, but I'll repeat your question.
Okay, so before...
The mic's coming right your way.
So my name is Christian, and I'm with the Global Challenges Foundation. So before you showed us this wonderful graph with technology on one hand and human adaptability on the other hand. And to bridge that gap, you need smart governance. So at Alphabet X, what do you do to actually bridge that gap as opposed to widening that gap?
Oh, well, governance, I think, in his slide meant more like public sector governance. There is, of course, governance at X, but it means something sort of different. But I'm going to interpret your question as at least partially corporate culture. So what I would say is that most businesses have a set of things they want people to do, and they tell them, go that way, be like this. And then everyone does this instead. If you work at a business, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It doesn't matter what business you're in, because it's like this in every business. The reason that people do this instead of what you just asked them to do is because these are the emotional paths of least resistance in the organization. And people do not care about your lip service. They only care about the emotional paths of least resistance in the organization. This is things like social norms. This is things like the incentives. Who do you actually promote? Who do you actually bonus? And what did they do right beforehand? Because it's like Pavlov's dog. They're just going to assume they should keep doing that. So you have to actually pay attention to what these emotional paths of least resistance are and move them this way to get what people do to be somewhat more like what you actually ask them to do. That's what it feels like at X. You know, to the more general governance question, I certainly believe that there are things that governments can do. But we are also seeing, I think, an explosion of the private sector and a complex web of for-profit and non-profit entities finding new ways to add value. For example, I think the breakthrough energy venture is a great example of something where there's a significant amount of money that they're very explicitly saying they're putting in to long-term, scary bets that are probably more long-term than almost any company otherwise would do. They're really the bets the government used to be placing. The government used to be in the moonshot business. But I think that now combinations of places like X and BEV are actually where you're going to see these things happening. And that, you know, we can choose to be sad about it, or we could actually just choose to be happy about it and say, great, I guess we need more BEVs, we need more X's. Like 2 of them is not enough. How can we get another 10?
Felix.
Yes. I'm sorry. Hi, I'm Felix Kramer. So Both of you have said incredibly exciting things, and we're going to talk about it among ourselves and a small number of other people. My question to you, and actually to Mark Thompson too, is why can't this be the conversation that we have every day, all over the world, all the time? Why can't 10 million people start talking about this now, all through next summer, and say, our election ought to be about this stuff. Our election ought to be about the climate, clean energy, clean jobs. Why are we talking about all these other things that are upsetting to us and divisive? Why can't all these things be an inspiring future for us?
Well, that's a good question. I'll take a quick stab at it and let Astro. You know, I'm a big believer, Felix, that to name something is to own it. If you can name an issue, you can own how people think about it. And unfortunately, for many years, the people who named green as an issue, were the people who hated it. So they named it sissy, girly man, unpatriotic, uneconomic, vaguely European. Vaguely European. You're vaguely European. And I can only tell you what I've been trying to do in my little niche is to rename green. Geopolitical, geoeconomic, humanitarian, capitalistic, patriotic. Green is the new red, white, and blue, to make it a national project. But unfortunately, when you have as president when you have a bully in the bully pulpit who is using that pulpit, it unfortunately in our world now, it can drown everything else. Astro, last word on this. What can we look forward to? How do we reshape, how do we bring your excitement and the excitement of what's going on there to a wider audience?
I think the fundamental problem is in our society, we don't share a basic set of facts. And if we don't share a basic set of facts, I don't think we have much chance of coming to some common understanding. And we don't have a basic set of facts because while science is not completely anathema to half of this country, it's not important relative to some of the other issues for them. And they feel, I think, like they've lost on the science front, and they don't want to compete in an area where they're not going to win. And I think before we have any more specific conversations, we need to get back to the place where we can all kind of respect how we get to the facts so that we can have a shared set of facts. If we don't have that, I think we're not going to make it, at least in terms of having a coherent conversation with the rest of our society.
You know, Astro, we don't have a shared set of facts. It's so true, but I am so glad we do have an X. I'm so glad we have people there really stretching the boundaries of science and imagination. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.
Really
Thanks, it was really great.